Tonight, we begin with a political eruption shaking the very foundations of Westminster. In an extraordinary series of events, Labour leader and Prime Minister Keir Starmer has seen his secret EU agreement fall apart, torpedoed by a quiet but devastating intervention from none other than Nigel Farage, and what sources describe as a deeply troubling meeting with King Charles III. The government's plan, according to multiple leaked documents, had been months in the making. What was presented to the public as a routine diplomatic summit was in fact something far more controversial, a sweeping realignment with the European Union that would have restored key elements of pre-Brexit cooperation without public debate or parliamentary vote. The draft deal reportedly included legal oversight by the European Court of Justice, a renewed youth mobility scheme that could reopen mass EU migration, and financial commitments to support EU defense initiatives, all framed under the language of pragmatic cooperation. But within Labour's inner circle, aides were well aware of how explosive the agreement truly was. It was crafted to avoid headlines, designed not to inform but to obscure. The strategy? Offer Brussels enough integration to satisfy their demands, without alarming British voters still loyal to the spirit of the Brexit referendum. That strategy, however, did not go unnoticed. Just as Starmer was preparing to host EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in London for what was to be the signing of the agreement, Farage, fresh from an electoral comeback, was already moving behind the scenes. He had quietly requested and secured a private meeting with King Charles III. What was discussed in that room has not been officially disclosed. But the consequences were immediate and severe. Within hours, the summit was postponed indefinitely. EU officials were blindsided. And inside number 10, panic set in. Multiple sources inside Downing Street described the Prime Minister as furious, storming out of security briefings, demanding answers, and questioning how Farage had managed to intercept one of the most sensitive diplomatic efforts of his premiership. Some aides described the atmosphere as near hysteria. Starmer, once considered the sober, stable alternative to his predecessors, was now pacing the halls of power, shredding briefing papers and shouting accusations at senior staff. What followed was a wave of leaks. Sections of the draft agreement made their way to the press. Among the revelations, clauses that would have reintroduced EU legal supremacy in trade disputes, aligned UK agricultural policy with EU regulations, and reopened UK borders to tens of thousands of EU youth with access to work, education, and public services, with no guaranteed reciprocity. Critics say this was not cultural exchange, it was re-entry by stealth. The very policies rejected by voters in 2016 were poised to return under new branding, without a single public debate. Palace sources now confirm that the king was gravely concerned by the implications of the agreement, especially the absence of parliamentary oversight. While the monarchy remains neutral by tradition, insiders suggest the timing of the summit's collapse was no accident. The message sent to Downing Street, though never made public, was unmistakable. In response, Farage vanished from the public stage, releasing only a cryptic post on social media. The tide is turning. Meanwhile, the fallout escalated rapidly. Senior Labour MPs began expressing concern about the lack of transparency. Some demanded full parliamentary scrutiny. Others, fearing backlash in their Leave voting constituencies, threatened open revolt. The fragile coalition Starmer had built between technocrats, Remainers, and moderate conservatives began to buckle. Internationally, the consequences were immediate. Brussels, caught off guard, responded with fury. Ursula von der Leyen was reportedly livid. French diplomats called for retaliation, including suspending fishing agreements and freezing defense cooperation. German officials, blindsided and frustrated, questioned the UK's credibility as a diplomatic partner. Back in London, Starmer's team scrambled to contain the damage. An internal investigation into the leaks was launched. Communications were locked down. Staff were barred from speaking to the press. But the damage had already spread beyond control. Adding fuel to the fire, an anonymous op-ed, believed to be sourced from within the palace, appeared in the press. It claimed that the king was deeply troubled by the erosion of national sovereignty contained in the draft deal. The article didn't name the Prime Minister, but the target was clear. The Crown, for the first time in modern memory, had cast doubt on the judgment of a sitting government. Inside number 10, fear turned to paranoia. Ministers began avoiding press engagements. Public appearances were cancelled. Leadership challenges, once whispered, became openly discussed in party backrooms. Labour MPs privately questioned whether Starmer's position was still tenable. Sources close to Nigel Farage say this was no accident. He had reportedly been compiling evidence for weeks, briefings, memos, legal drafts, documenting Starmer's quiet plan to realign with Europe. The strategy, insiders claim, was to rebuild ties irreversibly, without triggering the kind of political firestorm that a second referendum would provoke. It nearly worked, until one meeting with the king changed everything. Tonight, the UK is facing not just a political crisis, but a constitutional reckoning. A sitting prime minister stands accused of trying to rewrite Brexit in secret. A monarch, officially neutral, has made his unease felt in a way that has not been seen in generations. And Nigel Farage, once dismissed as a relic of a past political era, has returned, not with slogans, but with strategy. What comes next is uncertain. Trust has collapsed. Brussels is furious. Westminster is shaken. And the British public is now aware of what was almost done in their name, without their knowledge. The question now isn't just whether Starmer's EU deal is finished. The real question is whether his government is. Ask ChatGPT.